Mark, hi, I'm really glad to meet you today, and thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
It's an honor to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, actually, I'm honored to talk to you again, and I think today we'll have a very productive and efficient conversation on the gaps and achievements of the international law. The thing I wanted to start with is generally your quotation from our last interview, from the last year interview for Suspin, when you mentioned that the international law is very similar to the Swiss cheese because it has many gaps, many holes. At the same time, it has very firm and really important structure, and it's still a very efficient thing that we have in our lives. Can you give me at least three most important arguments why you actually, with all of your work, with all of your passion, really believe in the work of the international law, and why we should lean to this idea that it's really efficient despite all of these gaps and holes?
I think it's really interesting that we're having this discussion at the start of 2025, because this year marks the 80th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, which for me is one of the most significant milestones in modern history. It's the charter that established the legal framework for what was then a new world order. But it did more than that. It kind of codified the principles of international law, and it did so that it could govern relations between nations. And I just think that at the heart of international law is what it's about. And I always remember thinking back to the preamble of the UN Charter. It starts by saying that the overarching goal of this new charter is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm fundamental human rights.
Very much relevant, yeah.
Yeah, that's extraordinary to me that it embodied this idea that we could have a united global community, and a global community that was protected by legal principles. And that's what it is. It's these legal principles that underpin the ideas of peace and security. And it was a time in 1945 after World War II that truly the world came together and said, we need something different. And that difference was founded on legality, on legal principles and international law. And so I still hold dear to those principles and to the idealism that existed among those countries and individuals that came together in 1945 and said, we're going to create this remarkable legal document. It's really the constitution of the world. So that to me is at the heart of why I still believe in this concept of international law and the principles.
Yes, you say generally that it was some search for something different, some new world order and new principles of this world order. Actually, it seems to me that now is also very much a similar point in this regard, taking into account all these wars that are happening, the war in Ukraine, the wars in other parts of the world. So it's also the great challenge.
We're looking at that rules-based legal order that was painstakingly built after World War II and embodied in the UN Charter. And I think just this one aggression, this aggressive act by Russia against Ukraine is really, I think, a devastating blow to this principle. And that's why it's so important that Russia does not succeed. It's so important that we uphold these norms of international law. That's when this global order, that's when this legal rule-based order it becomes in jeopardy, and that's a problem. That's a real concern.
We will definitely take a closer look to the situation in Ukraine that you very much follow. But also, before, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your previous experience, because actually you worked in many tribunals, for example, some temporarily judicial institutions, like, for example, the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Also, there were another tribunals like Criminal Tribunal for Iraq, which tried Saddam Hussein, Cambodian War Crimes Tribunal. Which of these experiences for you were the most significant, and when you had maybe such a feeling that the new formation of the international law is really happening right behind your eyes?
I think all of them, in a particular way, came to that. It made me feel that we're in a different period of time. But it was really back for me in 1989. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall that I think shifted my own thinking about international law. Prior to that, of course, we were still in a Cold War. And so it was difficult, even when I just spoke about the UN Charter that came out of World War II, the world quickly went into this Cold War period, which made it much more difficult, if not impossible, to come together in a universal way, to look at legal principles from the eyes of one state, one country, but truly as a universal international community. So, but when 1989 happened in the fall of Berlin Wall, and I happened to be in Berlin that exact week that the wall fell, I was in East Berlin, and I was giving some lectures on economic issues and reforms. And I remember watching cars and people in East Berlin begin to move towards West Berlin. And I went over there early that next morning because nobody was interested in listening to me anymore. And I remember chipping away, or the wall had already been chipped away, and inside between the West and East was something called no man's land, and East Berlin soldiers were still patrolling that. And I called over to one of the soldiers and motioned to him to throw over his military cap, and I put a $10 bill in between the cracks. That would have been a lot of money back then in 1989 to an East Berlin wall. And I still have this cap. It's in my room, actually. Wow. And I thought then something dramatic obviously is happening. And it was the beginning of a transformation of the world, particularly of this region. But more importantly, we were now re-engaging in this idea of international law. And part of that engagement was focusing on accountability. The sovereign rights of states, as important as they are, do not permit human rights violations by the state against their own citizens or any other individual, and particularly for atrocity crimes. I had lived in Yugoslavia for 3.5 years in the 80s, and so I saw the country before, during, and after the war in the former Yugoslavia, and I felt accountability was absolutely critical. And this is what is manifested by these tribunals, is the idea that there are some crimes that are so heinous that the international community must, as a whole, ensure that those who perpetrate those crimes are brought to justice. That is embedded in the idea of law. And that's another example of the importance of international law.
Talking about the Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that previously this tribunal and some other of this kind, they at the very beginning, they lacked this trust of the people, so they had to spend some time for people to trust in this accountability process, and generally that these tribunals will manage to bring justice to those who need it. At the same time, talking about the current international institutions of the international law, can we say that this obstacle of distrust is already like it's not a problem anymore? So because actually, from my point of view, I see very polar thoughts on that. Because on the one hand, we see that people are pretty skeptical, especially on Ukraine. In Ukraine, for example, people are pretty skeptical about the justice. At the same time, some people try to rely on it because, like, what are the choices they have? So, what's your feeling about it?
Listen, international law, particularly accountability, as portrayed in or through these tribunals. It's not perfect. You don't have perfection in international law, and certainly not in ensuring that those who've committed atrocity crimes are brought to justice. You just won't have that. But I think the principle itself is now embedded in the international community. I don't think there's any debate about whether or not those who have committed crimes should be brought to justice. Now, the practicalities of getting those individuals brought to justice, to bring them to justice, that's different, that's separate. But emerging, prior to World War II, that would never have really been a concept that would have been accepted. After World War II, you had the Nuremberg trials, you had the Nuremberg principles, and you started gradually creating a principle of accountability within international law that states must adhere to, including in whether states want to adhere to it or not does not matter anymore. There's now, as I say, embedded the idea that those who commit these types of atrocity crimes must be brought to justice, and that's a responsibility that every country has. So that's a dramatic shift in the ethos of law and the understanding that individuals have about the importance of these principles. That's a critical shift that's occurred, and it's a pendulum shift that I don't think will ever come back. And because these tribunals were created then after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the thawing of the Cold War, you now have solidified not only the principles but the mechanisms to ensure that individuals are brought to justice, that there should be no impunity for these types of crimes. And of course, the creation of ad hoc tribunals, but ultimately the creation of a permanent international criminal court, that truly was a pinnacle of law and of accountability. And I think that that's something we should embrace, and we should celebrate that achievement, even though, as I said, it's not perfect.
Yeah, at the same time, when we should celebrate these achievements of the international law, it seems to me at the same time it's important to note that there are many differences that appear in the understanding of some terms of the international law, or there are some very different approaches from especially if you're talking about the International Criminal Court, that is very much dependent on the national countries and their governments. Actually, when I was preparing for this podcast, I also mentioned that you are the head of the International Bar Association, and it includes 194 countries, if I'm not mistaken, right? So generally, for me, it's impressive because it's so hard to somehow gain all of these people under one umbrella. I mean, if we're talking about such a great amount of countries, we can assume that these countries may have a different approach to some specifics of the international law. Do you feel that currently here there is much about these disagreements, or mostly it's still about some common ground on that?
Wouldn't be much a disagreement among individuals or countries that international law now ensures this principle of accountability for instance, atrocity crime. There are differences nuances as to the implementation of those principles, the mechanisms that exist for those principles, whether those principles should be focused on all the time, should be focused on sitting heads of states. That's a controversial issue that exists in international law. But I think the idea that there are differences in opinion should not detract from the idea that we still have these principles. We still have these as part of now international law. And you mentioned the IBA and the 194 countries. You know, I oftentimes mention that the IBA to me is like the United Nations for the legal community. And of course, in the United Nations, you have untold differences in opinions and positions, and you do that in the IBA as well. But you've touched on something that's quite important. Similar to the United Nations, the IBA brings together these diverse countries and views, and it's a way of continuing to have a debate and to try to move forward in embracing these international principles. In the end, whether it's the IBA's resolutions that we bring out, whether it's the United Nations and its resolutions, whether it's the countries that come together, whether it's the International Criminal Court that you mentioned, it's all about political will. It's the willingness of states to support international law, to abide by international legal principles. If you don't have the political willingness, it doesn't matter what mechanism you have, it won't work. So the International Criminal Court is a great mechanism, I think. It's a great structure. It has its issues, but it cannot function without the political willingness of states to support what the court stands for, to ensure that the court's decisions are supported. So it comes back to states and whether or not they are accepting of this idea that there are certain principles that are truly universal and that all states must accept, abide by them, and support those principles. If we lose that, then international law begins to crumble. And that's really the challenge we're facing today, I think.
For me, it sounds pretty tricky because on the one hand, we understand that, and you mentioned it several times in different interviews, that if states want to put some pressure on another states, they has to be ready to put some pressure on themselves, to be ready to answer before all of these principles on the international law and the institutions they've created themselves. But at the same time, we've seen that pretty much that it's, as you mentioned, very much about the political will, because if any case is somehow about themselves, about their allies, for example, it becomes very sensitive. The recent example that comes to my mind is generally how much criticism has this arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, received from the United States, and it was one of the pretexts of the pressure of the United States on the ICC. So it sounds like quite a dilemma. So is there any chance we can find any solution here, or nothing best is created here right now?
If you're asking me whether we will be in a situation where the hypocrisy of countries when it comes to legal principles will disappear, sadly, I don't think it will. The hypocrisy of governments and states when it comes to these types of principles is quite extraordinary to me. So you've mentioned an example of the arrest warrant towards Netanyahu and the immediate response from a number of countries that are aligned and politically aligned with Israel, and yet these are countries that would generally support the idea of accountability for those alleged to have committed atrocity crimes. But when it comes to the political realism, states, relationships among states, that all begins to fall apart. Now, when it comes specifically to Israel and the United States and in relations to the ICC arrest warrant, of course, we know the United States and Israel are not state parties to the Rome Statute, which is the statute of the International Criminal Court. So technically, they would not accept any arrest warrant or indictment coming from the International Criminal Court, and that's their right not to accept it because they're not state parties. But I do find it, again, hypocritical that at certain times countries will speak glowingly about the need for accountability, but when, for political reasons, it becomes more difficult for the country, then that country retreats. And that undermines the principles of international law. It undermines the world legal order because you have to abide by those, even when those principles are counter to your own actions.
Actually, I wonder how this efficient system of international law may exist in case that there is no United States in it, because we usually realize that the US is like the world's stakeholder, the world's biggest economy, biggest force in many areas, and here we see that they don't show any leadership. At the same time, they give even more difficulties. For example, for the ICC, you mentioned that they are not a state party. At the same time, also we've seen pretty aggressive claims, I'd say so, on the ICC address, like they also ready to implement some sanctions against it. So is there any chance that the US at some point may be interested in being more involved into this system?
Recent history doesn't suggest that it will. And certainly the recent US elections with the election of Donald Trump, I think ensures that the United States will stay far away from international justice. The country simply will not engage in supporting international justice, international principles. And as you've alluded to, the United States will actually be to the reverse. They will aggressively go after any institution, particularly the International Criminal Court, that upholds the concept of international justice. The United States will not, this administration will certainly not accept that. We already saw this once with the Trump administration and its attack against the International Criminal Court. I suspect that we will see an even more aggressive action against the ICC after January 20th. So it does not look well. It does not look good. I don't think one can look at the United States as the principal driver of international legal principles. I certainly am one who just doesn't feel that way anymore. And it's really interesting. We started this conversation by looking back 80 years ago with the creation of the UN Charter. And it was the United States more than any other country, not surprisingly coming out of World War II, but nonetheless, it was the United States and President Roosevelt, President Truman, these were the leaders who were responsible for creating this charter and these principles that have defined the international community for all of these years. But that's just simply no longer the case. The United States is not in that position any longer. And sadly, I don't see the United States, certainly over the next 4 years, having any positive impact on international law.
Maybe let's sum up this block about the International Criminal Court. Can we systematize really the most important values of the ICC? Because it seems to me we all got used to the thought that the ICC is really the most important international institution of the international justice, because it's the only international institution that can prosecute the individuals, not the countries, and that is really it really can bring those guilty to justice. So from your point of view, what are the main points we have to keep in mind here about the values of the ICC?
Well, I think one thing we should keep in mind is that the ICC, if we're looking to the ICC as the savior for international criminal law, then that's wrong. That's on us. We shouldn't be doing that. The ICC alone simply cannot play that role. The ICC is one component of a larger kind of a larger context of international justice. It's an important one. But it's not the only one. And you have to then look back to something I alluded to earlier. You have to look at the involvement, the engagement of individual states and what their position is on international criminal law, international accountability. And if you don't have sufficient number of states who are supporting these principles, then things become significantly weaker. And the ICC, as I said earlier, will not be able to sustain itself if states don't provide that type of support and adherence to these international legal principles.
Speaking of the ICC and Ukraine, now we see that the International Criminal Court has already issued 6 arrest warrants for the Russians who are responsible for the war in Ukraine somehow, and in particular, President Putin himself. That is like the most important thing. At the same time, generally, we talk about how the ICC works and how many arrest warrants it usually issues. Can we say that the effectiveness of the work of the ICC or its productivity has raised on the background of the war in Ukraine? Or we can say that it's a sign of a great cooperation between the Ukrainian prosecutors, for example, and the ICC prosecutors who work in Ukraine. So how can we explain such actually a great amount of arrest warrants that we see right now?
I think it's important to bifurcate the ICC in relations to Russia's war against Ukraine. And I think the very fact that the ICC took the step, that the prosecutor took the step for an arrest warrant against a sitting head of state, it's not the only time that the ICC has issued arrest warrants to sitting heads of states that we know. But by far, it's the most important, because we've never had up until the Netanyahu situation, the arrest warrant filed against Mr. Putin, not only a sitting head of state, but of a major nuclear power country, is significant. And so I think we should, as I said earlier, I think we should, as the international community, I think we should applaud that. I think that was an exceedingly important step that the court made. It was critical to me that the international community, the International Criminal Court made that statement and put it on record. It's a significant milestone in international criminal law. But the other side of the coin is, as I said earlier, is the implementation. It's, can you actually ensure that Vladimir Putin is brought to The Hague? Here, I say we have to be very cautious on this. That's not going to happen anytime soon. That's not going to happen, for a foreseeable future. international law plays the long game. And we've seen history where a sitting head of state, al-Bashir is one, Gaddafi is one, Milosevic is another one, where they thought they were immune from any, not only any international pressure, but any domestic pressure. And all of that changed. So as difficult as it is to think that Vladimir Putin would never be dethroned, history doesn't support that position. Oftentimes, these authoritarians, these dictators, they lose support domestically, and I'm convinced that's eventually going to happen to Mr. Putin. And therefore, the work that's being done, the collaboration that's being done with the ICC in Ukraine and the Ukraine's prosecutor, the Ukraine's legal system is very important because we're working together in upholding and supporting the idea of accountability. And if not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then in a year from now. If not a year from now, then in the future. There's no statute of limitations on these types of crimes. And that is something we need to always remember. And we need to continue to put the resources in with the understanding that one day these individuals who have committed these crimes are going to be brought to justice because international law demands it.
Actually, there is some limitations, like Putin's age already. But at the same time, I really like your optimism, Mark, but it seems to me I ask you this question every time. Like, we've had these arrest warrants, but none on the dock right now. And it's pretty not enough consolation for the people who suffer from the Russian missiles every night in Ukraine. So I ask you this question again, and it never gets old.
By the way, you should ask me that question, and the Ukrainians should never stop asking that question because it goes directly to the international community, and it goes directly to the willingness of the international community to ensure that these individuals are brought to justice. So I'm never discouraged by that question. That question should be asked, and we should continue to be asking states and the international community to uphold and to assist the International Criminal Court. But what I am saying is that this is where you begin to see some of the holes in the Swiss cheese, because it comes back to the political willingness. We should keep hammering states to ensure that these individuals that arrest warrants, regardless of who they are, whether it's Mr. Putin, whether it's a general, whether it's a soldier, those that have alleged to have committed these crimes need to be brought to justice. And all I'm saying is keep that close to our hearts. That the principle is there, it's not going to disappear, and the short term may not see the results that we want, but I'm arguing that in the long term, I believe it will show the results. And I believe that not because I'm always optimistic, but I'm a bit of an historian. So I look back at history and I see examples of where that happens. And I believe this is going to happen in regards to Russia and Ukraine. But I also believe that we need to be steadfast in continuing to push the international community to uphold these principles and to ensure that Russia does not escape with immunity for its war against Ukraine. That I'm absolutely adamant about.
Actually, it seems to me also we have to mention that these arrest warrants, they also have, on this point of time, it also has some effect. Like, for example, the deepening the isolation of Russia. Putin is not so much handshaked as it used to be before, so he's pretty much isolated as a world's leader as well. So generally, there is still some effect, but of course, it's not enough at this point if we're talking about the perspective.
And you're absolutely right. And it certainly won't be enough for the victims of his atrocities. No question about that. But you bring up that's a really important point to make. he is in essence, other than being able to travel to a handful of countries that are similar to whose leaders are similar to Putin, he really can't go anywhere, and that's got to be frustrating for somebody like Mr. Putin, who is now he's fenced in into within his own country or within a country that would include several other countries. But other than that, he's an indicted war criminal, and that will never disappear. That will historically that is there forever. I think I'm pretty certain it does bother him, and that's the one of the important elements of what the court does.
Yeah, well, at least it bothers his ego, hopefully. So, yeah, at least.
It is that. Yeah.
What I also mentioned, you may correct me here, but what I noticed that usually when the international law experts try to somehow inspire some optimism, they remind us that the international law works. So they mention the case, for example, of Slobodan Milosevic, who ended up on the dock in Hague, and it's really the bright and remarkable example of that. But at the same time, it was the Special Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. It was not the ICC at that time. But if we take into account who were on the dock in The Hague in the ICC, mostly these were the African leaders, the people from the African countries. Why is it so difficult, maybe, to prosecute the people from our region, from our part of the world, or it's mostly also very much connected with the concentration of the conflicts that happened into these 3 decades as the ICC existed?
Well, I think it's all of that. No continent is more important to the ICC than Africa, because African nations were the first, really, I mean, certainly part of the first tranche of countries that supported the ICC, that signed up as state parties, and in doing so, they immediately accepted the court's jurisdiction. At times, they asked the court to investigate and to pursue indictments in their own countries. And so I think that that's a credit to a number of countries. But yes, there has been criticism, and I think rightfully so, that when you look at the map, one can say it's skewed a bit towards that continent. I think that's evening out now, and I think you'll continue to see that happening, but the political pressures that exist in some countries to accept, not only to accept the ICC's jurisdiction, but to support it, that exists. That's clear. But we have to remember too that the ICC is the court of last resort, the court that only will act if a country is unwilling or unable to pursue these particular cases. And so I think that that's important. There are situations that have emerged in countries where, under this principle of complementarity, countries have been able to take on that responsibility. And in doing so, the ICC doesn't have the jurisdiction, wouldn't take the jurisdiction.
At the same time, we understand that in the case of Ukraine, there are some details about its jurisdiction, and we understand that in this case, we can't prosecute Russia's actions and Russia's leadership actions for the crime of aggression, and that is the reason that Ukraine for 3 years has been discussing how to create the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. Actually, here in this question, I'll again be the bad policeman, and I'll ask why exactly we've been working at it for 3 years and nothing of it. Like, we've got a core group, we've got many discussions on different levels, but at the same time, we don't have the tribunal, and we don't see much of a political will from our partners, especially, to create it. So why it's so hard to implement into reality?
I remain so disappointed about the lack of movement in solidifying and ultimately creating this special tribunal for the crime of aggression. As we
And
know,
you personally hoped it will be sooner, right?
well, I had always, I had argued, I've been arguing for 3 years that this court needs to be created. And the longer you wait, the more difficult it will be to create this tribunal. And unfortunately, we're now facing a situation where we could be in a position where the court special tribunal does not come to fruition. And the reason is a couple. One, you have a new president of the United States. The United States was really never supportive of this special tribunal anyway, even under the Biden administration. It certainly won't support it under the Trump administration. So that's gone. There are still key major states in Europe that have not supported the idea of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression on this. Lastly, if there is a settlement of what I refer to as a forced settlement, because I think that might be what we're witnessing, then the tribunal will not be able to survive. There will be not, it would, in a negotiation, on a negotiation table, in my opinion, that any idea of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is again focused on individuals, which would mean Vladimir Putin, I don't think that doesn't survive. So time is running out, and I'm still going to promote it. I'm still advocating for it. I'll continue to do that because I think it's exceedingly important. I've always said, if the circumstance that we've witnessed over the 3 years of Russia's war against Ukraine, if that does not justify a special court for the crime of aggression, then I don't know what is. What would justify? This is the singular act after World War II that I think would demand this special tribunal. I hope it comes to fruition. I'll continue to push for that until I can't.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned this important point about the possible negotiation process that may be launched by the next US President Donald Trump. And actually, that is something that worries me as well, because I remember several times in your previous interviews, you mentioned that it's important to make this tribunal a reality before any negotiation process starts, because not creating this tribunal may be some pressing point for Vladimir Putin. Like it may be his condition for some kind of a peace. Do you feel that now we are moving in this pretty dangerous direction when it will never be created?
Yeah, I've always, the fact that you remembered that I've said that over the years, I maintain that position that the tribunal has to be created and should have been created a long time ago, because the closer you get to any negotiated settlement of this conflict, and I have real problems with how potentially this settlement is going to happen, particularly with the Trump administration, then the further away you get from the reality of a tribunal. I cannot see the tribunal existing if in fact President Trump gets his way, and if he believes he can force a settlement on Ukraine, then the idea that a special tribunal for the crime of aggression would survive, then the answer would be no. I don't think it will. But we're not at that point yet, and I think we still continue to push for this special tribunal. As you said, there is the core group. There is an agreement within Europe to create it. So we've moved within 3 years. We certainly had progress, but we're not over the finish line yet. That's where we need to be on this.
Of course, it also will be justified to note that we are not talking about only this level of the international law in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war. And the biggest part of the burden is taken by the Ukrainian courts, because apart from the ICC and possibly in the future of the International Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, we have hundreds of Ukrainian courts who are dealing with the thousands cases. Currently, we have more than 140,000 cases of the Russian war crimes documented here in Ukraine. Generally, from your point of view, you come to Ukraine regularly, you have some common ground with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General Office and other people who are connected to this process. Do you feel that Ukraine is really doing its best in this direction of bringing the justice?
I want to say this as objectively as I can on this, because I always feel important to be very upfront on my opinions on these various issues. And over my 3 years during the war and coming to Ukraine regularly, I have to say that I have been exceedingly impressed with the efforts of Ukraine domestically to build the capacity to bring to justice those that have committed these crimes. That's a significant hill to climb. Under the best of circumstances, it's difficult to create a system and a structure to focus on war crimes. And to do so during a war is nearly impossible. And yet I think Ukraine has been doing that successfully. There are always issues you can improve on, but my point is Ukraine is always looking for ways to improve it, and they're doing that. So I've been just so impressed with the legal community in Ukraine focused on ensuring that that justice happens. And by the way, Ukraine hasn't shied away from domestic prosecutions or focus on its own soldiers who have committed the crimes, because Ukraine understands that's going to be part of their legacy, is how they deal with these cases, including ensuring that the suspects, defendants who are accused of committing these crimes, are also provided representation. That's not an easy thing to argue in the midst of a war, particularly one that has taken the lives of so many Ukrainians. But for the principle of accountability and law, international, getting back to what we started with, international principles of law, it's very important that Ukraine does it. And it is doing that. And so I give very high marks to Ukraine for its efforts in this field. And by the way, even in Yugoslavia, decades later, war crimes are still occurring, and that will happen in Ukraine as well. This is not something that the war crimes cases will not end, even if the war ends. There's no, as I said earlier, there's no statute of limitations. Ukraine will continue to pursue, as they should, those that have committed the crimes in Ukraine. And the international community should be there to support that. I will certainly continue to be there to support that.
Thank you. It's really important to hear. And it seems to me that now it's really from the Ukrainian part, it's very much of understanding that it's needed to be done. Like, for example, this integration of Ukraine officially to the ICC. Since the beginning of this year, Ukraine has become the party to the Rome Statute. So these are these steps that were needed for many years before, but it's great that they are right now. What I also wanted to clarify is also on the one hand, we understand that there are many good parts that we are talking about the justice that is happening right in time of the war conflict when it is ongoing. At the same time, can we say that there are also some maybe not so obvious but still dangerous part about it. I mean, for example, we see the arrest warrants against Putin, Maria Lvova-Belova for deportation of Ukrainian children, and at the same time we see that this crime is continuing to happen, although all of these arrest warrants there are, but Russians are trying to hide it better than previously. So can't we say that there are some dangers of this process as well that we have to keep in mind, that we have to follow very clearly in all of these stages of this process?
I think so. I think there's always, and again, it's undoubtedly frustrating to Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainians who see that the ICC has an arrest warrant for a particular crime, and that's this egregious crimes against children and deportation of children, and yet it continues, and so that's this bifurcation of international law, the principles versus the reality of actually implementing arrest warrants, and that goes back to my point of political willingness on this. But I think for now, it's exceedingly important that Ukraine continues to build cases, to build the evidence that can be used to even force the international community in turn to force Russia to relinquish, for instance, children that have been taken illegally, to put greater pressure on Russia to ensure that the crimes that are being committed that there needs to be understanding that they cannot be done with impunity. Collecting evidence, ensuring the evidence is there is really quite important because, as I say, these cases will continue to go on and on. The IBA has this project Eyewitness to Atrocities, which is allowing pictorial evidence to be collected. And I think we've got nearly 80,000 videos and pictures that are all verified as on their accuracy and that can be used in a court of law. Not all of them are being used yet in a court of law, but it's important to maintain the database and to maintain the vault, if you will, for this evidence that will eventually be used, and that's really important in today's position.
Mark, to sum up, it seems to me usually it's very much in a human's nature to complain much about everything, of course, as well about the international law, that the international justice is a too long process. It's not delivered at once as we waited so much. It's a difficult process. At the same time, can we say that there is something that we somehow can make it faster, at least a little bit? Is there any chance that any of us can make some kind of impact here to bring those guilty to justice? You mentioned about the collecting evidence. It's the option for some people, for example, on the occupied territories or just territories that are just been freed. But what other aspects of this issue may be also important and valuable from other people?
One, I don't shy away, nor would I ever question the criticisms, the doubts that exist about international law, particularly international criminal law, accountability law. I would be a fool to say, well, those criticisms are harsh. They're not harsh. That's the reality. But I respond by saying, as challenging, as difficult, as disheartening as it is to see the principles being proffered but not implemented, as difficult as that is, as disheartening as that is, I want us to keep faith and to understand that the very voice of international law that has been steadfast, particularly in Ukraine, to say that those who have committed these crimes must be brought to justice. I think we have a responsibility of not only embracing those principles, which I think we all do, as I said at the start, but to ensure that those principles are supported through the implementation of mechanisms to arrest and to bring to justice those individuals. That comes with political willingness, and political willingness is strengthened by voices from the public, by individuals that continue to demand from states and its leaders to abide by these principles and to eventually ensure that these individuals are brought to justice. It's not a perfect solution, but I think it's a very important one for us to remember and not to give up, not to lose faith, because I believe that international law will prevail and these principles will be upheld.
Mark, it seems to me in the very end it will be a mistake not to ask you, talking to a person of such an immense experience in the international law, not to ask you about your, maybe not predictions, mostly about your hopes. Maybe you would like to work in the future with some particular case connected to the Russian aggression, because you currently follow that situation very closely. Maybe in the ICC, maybe in the International Tribunal, if it will be created, or in some other court.
Well, I think nothing would please me more than to play some role in a future special tribunal for the crime of aggression. That, I think, would be something that would be first and foremost for me. The second would be to continue to assist Ukraine to strengthen its domestic capacity to undertake these war crimes cases. I've worked in that, as I said, as you know, for the last 3 years, and I'll continue to work with that because I think that's so important for Ukraine's legacy. Ukraine will come out of this war, as devastating as it is, with an important, I think, achievement, and that is it will be showing the world that, unlike Russia, Ukraine abides by international law, international principles, that Ukraine wants to be and is part of the international community, an international community that looks to this rules-based order. It's not something that Russia does. It's not something that other authoritarian countries do, but Ukraine is part of that community. And I'm very proud to be part of helping Ukraine with that achievement.
Yeah, it really feels good to be on the right side of the history.
Yes, very true. Yeah.
Yeah.